Hi, virtual class. It's me again, Mr. Simpson. I had a lot of fun making those scenes that I've been sharing with you over the last few weeks. But today I want to try something a little bit different. I want to tell you about history. Theater history. Stuff that happened in the theater years and years and years ago. Before you were born, before I was born, before your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents, grandparents were born. Maybe not that far back. Anyways, it was also really, really far away, in a place called Asia, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Now, I've never even been there before. I would like to go there someday. Some of you have already been to Asia, and maybe you know a little bit about the theater I'm going to be talking about today. When I have shared about Asian theater before, usually I just focus on kabuki theater from Japan. As I was going through my old notes and refreshing my research on the topic, I realized that kabuki theater had a lot in common with other Asian performing arts. All these performing arts still practice today, but they started hundreds of years ago, back when people would spend hours and hours just watching these performances all day long. The actors would train for decades to perfect their movements and their storytelling abilities. So let's begin in Japan. Then I'll tell you about the performing arts in India and then in China. Hey, that sounds like a really good quiz question. What 3 countries will Mr. Simpson talk about? "400 years ago in Japan, kabuki theater was started by a woman named Okuni. Now, kabuki theater, the word kabuki means to tilt, or to lean, or to bend slightly out of the ordinary. And that's really good because kabuki was like this wild action comic book that came to life. The characters painted on their faces with a white base. Then they would add black paint around their mouth and around their eyes. And some would even put on red paint to show intense emotion of the hero. If the character had any blue or brown paint, then he was some kind of a spirit or a monster. Then they would wear up to 12 kimono jackets. Think about wearing 12 different jackets, one on top of the next one, and it would weigh about 50 pounds. They would take them off for costume changes. And they didn't have 3D movies 400 years ago. However, the kabuki theater had something else that the audience loved just as much during the time. They had a runway, sometimes 2 runways, that extend from the stage and out into the audience so that the actor could walk out into the crowd and the actors would walk straight through them. And there wasn't a lot of other entertainment back then, so the crowds would get really loud and worked up and excited for these shows. The shows would sometimes go for 12 hours until the king or the shogun would, in Japan, he would make a new rule saying that 8 hours for a play was the absolute maximum. So the Japanese theater was, and still is, really, really tough to get into if you want to be an actor. If the family you haven't been performers for generations, then you probably won't get to be an actor either. However, if your ancestors were actors, then you might not even have any choice but to be an actor. And you would start learning as soon as you could walk. But you wouldn't be considered a professional until you've been acting kabuki theater for 40 years. Could you imagine practicing this stuff for 40 years before anybody took you seriously? Now that leads me to bunraku, which is the puppet theater. But it's not just like playing with toys. Again, you would have to be born into this family of puppet actors, and you would have to progress very slowly. The puppet consists of a head, and then 2 arms, and then 2 feet. And it takes 3 people to move the puppet. One of them to move the head and one of the arms, and the other puppeteer would just move the other arm. And the last puppeteer would just move the feet. And only the puppet master would be able to operate the head and the right arm. And to become the puppet master, you would have to first be a foot operator for 10 years. And then you could graduate to being the arm mover for another 10 years. You would have to spend a minimum of 20 years to finally operate the head and the right arm on your puppet. The puppet shows were very emotional shows, not like the ones you would see on Sesame Street or with the Muppets. All at the end of the Bunraku shows, they were very emotional, and most of the people in the audience would be left sobbing and crying because the plays were that sad.